Hi, and welcome to the PilotFish eiConsole. Today we'll be taking a quick look at the DTCC related functionality available in the eiConsole. To do this, I'll open up this POV to minimal CSV route. You can see in this route, we'll be receiving data via directory listener, converting it to XML using our file specification editor and the flat file transformation module, route that data to a single target transformation. That target transformation will map these fields from the DTCC file onto an XML representation of CSV, convert that data to CSV, and ultimately use a directory transport to drop that in a downstream directory so that a target system can pick it up for further processing. DTCC files look a bit like what I've shown you on the screen right here. It's an EDI type format where the first 2 or 4 bytes of each line specify the structure of the file that we need to parse. The first thing we'll need to do is parse this into an XML representation so it can be processed through the remainder of the eiConsole. If we click on the source transformation, we can see that this is done with the delimited and fixed width file transformation module. We can open up the file specification editor to see exactly how we define a DTCC EDI format for the file specification editor and engine to process. The tree on the left-hand side of the file specification editor describes the structure of the file that we need to parse. And our job when describing a new format to the file specification editor is to build this tree. You'll see that we have 3 components in this tree: record types, each of these which represent a record type, in this case, of a DTCC file; fields, represented by each of these blue nodes, in this case, represented by a name, start position, end position, and length; and in the case of a complex flat file, a record control. And what this record control is doing for us is it's helping us take a look at those first 2 to 4 characters of each line in the file and determining based on that what field we're parsing. So for instance, if we see 1307 as the first 4 bytes of the file, we understand that it's a contracts event record that is laid out as specified here. But the great thing about the PilotFish eiConsole's DTCC capabilities is that you don't need to build this by hand, which you would normally do by right-clicking, adding fields, and adding records. Instead, when you create a new file specification, you have the ability to import that definition directly from what we call a DTCC format. You may ask, what is a DTCC format? The DTCC EDI formats are published by the Accord organization and can be downloaded from their website if you're an Accord member, or can be provided to you by a trading partner. It's an Excel format that has a data dictionary and then specific layouts for each of the different record types that we were just previously talking about. Selecting this file during the import process by choosing Import from DTCC format, clicking Next, and simply selecting the appropriate XLS file will build this tree for us. Now, for the case of this demonstration, I've used the POV file. However, the DTCC encompasses a number of other EDI flat file formats, all of which can be handled exactly the same way, whether it's app sub, commissions, etc. So let's take a look at how this step looks in practice. I'll do that by switching to the testing mode of the eiConsole. Here, I'll choose to start my test with that conversion of the DTCC file to XML in the delimited and fixed width file stage. And I'll end the test immediately thereafter. I'll choose my sample PVF sample data and click Open. The sample data is exactly what I just showed you before. But once it's been processed through that file specification editor and engine, you can see we will have generated an XML representation of the file. The record types in the file now represented by XML elements, and the individual fields by elements with their associated content. Now we can use the rest of the eiConsole's XML-based mapping and data transformation tools to turn this XML format into absolutely anything we like. In this case, we use the data mapper to map these fields onto a specific CSV format. Let's take a quick look at that. I'll move along to the target transformation and click the Edit button next to our mapping. This will launch the data mapper. Once the data mapper opens, we'll see three panels. On the left-hand side, we'll again see the DTCC format, all of the various record types that were in that file that we just ingested. And on the right-hand side, I've loaded in an XML representation of a CSV that I'd like to generate. Simply put, each row in my CSV is going to be represented by an XCS record, and each field or column represented by these tags. This is done simply by selecting the source format of either DTCC, like we showed in the file specification editor, or our output format, in this case, a sample CSV. Then creating the mapping is as simple as drag and drop. It'll simply iterate through each one of the different contract records in my incoming POV file and output a XCS record, or in this case, a CSV row, where each one of the corresponding columns is populated by the appropriate value from my source format. You can see we can do this for simple one-to-one mapping from the contract record, like contract number, QSIP number, etc. I could pull data out of a header or parent record. You can see here I'm pulling the valuation date from the submitting header. And I can even work with the complex related records, such as dates and individual values. So for instance, here we want to get the policy issue date, but I need to do that by getting a date from a contract dates record. I do that by calling an XSL template with a qualifier 092, which is the DTCC qualifier for policy issue date. We'll see that when we process a contract's dates record, there are a whole bunch of different date elements, each one of which has its own corresponding qualifier. If I look underneath the mapping on the left-hand side here, I can understand what each one of these fields means by clicking on the DTCC tab and reading the description. And in the case of an enumerated field, I can even take a look at the codes. So here, how did I find out that 092 was the appropriate qualifier for a policy issue date? I simply clicked on the codes field and then scrolled down until I found the issued effective date. The same thing can be done with various contract values with contract value qualifiers. In this particular mapping, we've included two helper templates to get contract date and contract value based on that qualifier. Let's take a look at how one of those works. The first thing we need to do is to find the appropriate contract dates record for the current contract number that we're working with. And then we go through each one of the contract dates elements and look for the one that has the appropriate qualifier value. When we find it, we simply output that value. These patterns can be seen repeatedly in various DTCC formats, but can be easily handled by the eiConsole and the data mapper. Let's switch back to our testing mode and take a peek at how this roll back. Let's leave the data mapper and go back to the test mode and take a peek at how this looks. Now in testing mode, I'm again going to start with my source transformation, but this time I'm going to allow this to run all the way through the data mapping. I'll again select my same sample file, and you can see that we'll have our DTCC EDI format as the initial data. As before, the data is parsed into an XML representation. But now we can take a look at the output of the XSLT stage. The output of our data mapper now shows that we've processed one contract, contract number 1. We've pulled out its QSIP. We found the appropriate process date, etc. Fields that were not present in the input are simply left as empty and will ultimately be rendered as empty columns in our CSV. Looking once again at the overall route, we can see that the final step is a simple CSV transformation module. At this point, the route knows nothing about the fact that this was originally a DTCC format. It's just taking the XML output of the data mapper, which is formatted in such a way where each XCS record becomes a row and field underneath it a column, and converts that into a standard CSV and drops to file. Running this through testing mode once more. Again, we'll start with our sample data. Everything else is the same, but we let it run through to the end, and we can see that ultimately we've generated a CSV with the appropriate column headers. Of course, this is just an example. Real life examples can become much more complex with many more fields. You don't need to go to a CSV. You can go to a database, to another XML format, to JSON, etc. It's also worth noting that these transformations from DTCC to an XML format can also work in reverse. So the eiConsole really provides a tremendous amount of utility in being able to both parse and generate any DTCC EDI format without having to do any coding specific to the details of that spreadsheet that defines the format. Thank you for watching.